welcome. It's the first of our roundup discussions and we're going to be talking about New York. I've got an amazing set of panellists with me to dissect all the action from the Big Apple and chat about their favourite shows. But I'll let you guys introduce yourselves to kick things off.
Hi, I'm Harriet Walker. I'm news editor at Never Underdressed.
Hi, I'm Macalister-Smith. I'm the fashion features editor at matchesfashion.com.
Hi, I'm Jo Jones, the fashion editor of The Observer.
I'll start with a really simple question. What was the standout show from New York for you guys? I presume everyone's going to say Marc Jacobs, so we can all say Marc Jacobs and something else if you want. What did you love, Harriet?
Marc Jacobs.
Yeah.
It was really good. I thought Proenza was beautiful as well. Really, really amazing.
What struck you about it so much?
Well, I think they're a brand that is known for sort of doing things differently. In some ways they feel very New York, in other ways not at all New York, and I quite like the way they bring those two elements into play, in that it's immediately very glamorous and very, very wearable, very commercial, but there's so much thought behind it as well. It's actually quite a kind of intellectual collection when you look at it as garments perhaps rather than just clothes.
Interesting. What struck you, Tilly? What were you impressed by?
In terms of Proenza or just other collections?
Just in New York in general?
I mean, I really did like Altazara. I think he sort of does that clever thing of making very sort of appealing clothes that seem effortless to wear, but with a bit more thought behind it. So it's not just like a white neoprene t-shirt. You know, it's got a bit more sort of reference to it, but not in a heavy-handed way. I really like that actually.
How about you, Jo? What was your standout of the New York?
I love Marc Jacobs. I think it's interesting actually how much black and how dark things are this season.
So dark, wasn't it?
Yeah, really. That's quite interesting. And as with Harriet, you know, Proenza Schuler, but they're always a big favourite because they feel slightly non-New York, and they experiment a lot more than some of the designers there. So I think for me, I think I was a big fan of Marc this season.
Before we talk too much about the individual shows, I do want to pick up on something you've all kind of hinted at here, where you said Proenza feel very New York, but also not New York. And let's try and pin down a little bit. What do we mean when we say New York? What would we say its fashion identity is?
I think it's difficult because people say New York sometimes and it sounds like an insult.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be. It just means, I think there is a sort of stereotype of American designers making things that are very wearable, very easy, practical, but still quite glamorous and kind of uptown feeling. And that has been, in recent seasons, more interesting than it used to be, personally, I think, because as well as doing that, a lot of New York designers are throwing in quite a bit of fashion history, I think, and that feels new for America, I think, anyway. Obviously, Marc Jacobs is sort of beyond that bracket, but this season there were references to sort of mid-century American sportswear, which is, you know, a huge tradition in that design scene. But there was also sort of flashes of, I thought, 80s, 90s avant-garde in there, you know, Com and Junior references, deconstruction, and that felt really new for a New York Fashion Week.
I think what New York designers are really good at doing in a sweeping statement is taking those references and applying it in quite a relevant way, so through the fabrics and into the clothes, rather than putting on sort of costumey presentations. It's applied in quite a sort of clever way. And yes, they are, you know, largely very commercial collections, but it's something that actually feels really relevant now. You know, you take someone like Cathy Horan, she's talking specifically to the clothes, you know, within a collection there was a great cut pair of trousers, or there was a great blouse, or and actually it's a really sensible way of looking at the collections as well. And we were just saying before, actually, one of the things about New York is so much happens off the runway, you know, there's so many showroom-based presentations, and that's really important. And that sort of middle tier of, I suppose, upper contemporary, you know, elevated contemporary brands really make up quite a bulk of what happens in New York over that week, I think. So you can't really ignore that stuff as well.
So we don't think there's sort of too much on the schedule. That's a criticism that quite a few journalists, I think Eric Wilson made the comment, and as did Alex Fury over here, that it's so packed, the schedule. We don't have a problem with that.
Well, I mean, I was talking to, I was interviewing Takun recently, and he said one of his, what's the biggest challenge you face as a designer? And he said the thing is, there's so much. How do you distinguish, you know, yourself from everybody else? How do you sort of like define what your message is? And I think it's a challenge for the designers as much as it is for us looking at the shows. You know, it's harder for them.
I think that's a really good point, actually, trying to have an identity in New York. I think that's always something that's a little bit, you know, there's so much to see there. Actually, I think it is really hard, as you say, to carve out a specific identity as a designer. Do you think maybe that's why we all find Proenza so exciting, because they have such a clear sense of what they're doing?
I think so. I think there's been a number of years where much of the stuff on the schedule in New York was this sort of bland minimalism, which is very nice to wear and very easy to sell, but it doesn't, you couldn't necessarily tell one person from another from what they were doing. And that's, I think, beyond Proenza as well, that's why this season was interesting, because it felt like everyone had developed sort of along that theme, but in quite individual and different ways.
Also, because I find with New York that a lot of the show spaces are quite blank.
Yeah.
So from previous years, you've sat and looked at exactly what you've said, quite a minimal collection in a minimal space. So there's very little to kind of be excited about. So, sort of new designers that crop up, and even show in a sort of warehouse in the middle of nowhere, or you're going to a showroom, just adds a little bit of colour to a label, which I think a lot of the time in New York, historically you didn't have, but I think things have changed, which is why we were saying it's interesting to look at those smaller labels that maybe not on the big schedule, the accessory designers.
Well, it's all part of telling that story and setting the scene, isn't it? And that's what I think you can't underestimate, the power of being present. At that, there's so much you can get off the screen, but actually being in a showroom, or being in a show and seeing that venue and seeing the lighting, the hair, the makeup, the music, having it all come together, it really creates an atmosphere.
Yeah. I wonder if I always think, being in New York, you feel like you're on a film set anyway. So I wonder if it's because of that. A lot of designers have tried to get away from what's going on outside, because it all looks so terrible word, but iconic. So they show in these sort of very minimal blank spaces. But what I noticed were a few shows felt like they'd been a bit Londonified, I thought. So there was a fantastic opening ceremony show that was in a sort of old pier in a car park. Where else? There were a lot of sort of presentations in sort of old industrial spaces, and you had to sort of go up kind of creaky staircases to get in, and that felt like something different as well. And it was sort of like almost using that film set to sort of help tell the story.
I want to talk a little bit, a few of you have hinted at this, some of the younger brands that we're seeing on the schedule. And I don't think that traditionally we would say that New York is a place that really fosters its young talent, but I think perhaps that is changing a little bit. Are there any really young people sort of starting out? There was a lot of buzz about Creatures of the Wind. Is there anyone who kind of struck you as being really on their way up?
I thought, I went to Wes Gordon's show, and I thought that it was really great. I think he's just been picked up by Harrods for spring. And it was very New York, but it was really pretty. The kind of the intricacy and the technical skills were there. It was sort of working this incredibly fine lace and making it into something that's really quite structured, still kind of romantic. I really enjoyed that show. I thought he was sort of one to watch. And again, it felt like that's interesting. They've given him the slot, the space to be on that schedule.
Is there anyone that impressed you?
I think there's quite a nice little sort of gang of those very feminine, very sort of vintage inspired, like Calla, Honor, those kind of very feminine labels that you can see, it's quite Leith Clarkey, it's quite Lexa Chungy, that sort of thing. And I think New York do that pulled together uptown girl in quite a sweet, romantic way. That's very appealing, I think, to a lot of girls buying those clothes.
For sure. I want to talk a bit about something we mentioned I'm so interested about. You said there was a lot of black this season, it felt quite dark. Why? Because this is spring summer, and I think a comment that everyone made on almost all of our panels was, this doesn't look like a spring summer collection, this doesn't look like a spring summer collection. It kept coming up. Why was the mood so somber? Was it somber, or was it just black?
I think it's also the fact that a lot of the collections will hit store in February. So realistically, you're not going to be wearing high summer in February. And I noticed there are a lot of coats, which it makes sense. It makes sense to, and there's so many, you probably know more, but the amount of drops that they'll have in stores, so they have to think through. In fact, the collections slightly become a little bit seasonless, because each collection has to have so many components.
Absolutely.
It covers all the elements.
From starting with a coat and ending with a bikini.
Yeah.
So it goes all the way through.
Exactly. But as much as there was black, there was so much white. But then you have someone like Marc Jacobs presenting a fully black collection, who says, who actually really dresses in top to toe white every day. So I think it is people attuning.
So pleased to hear that as well. So pleased to hear it's not just me that spills things.
Tomato ketchup.
Exactly. Black in summer is way okay by me.
But it was heavier, you know, there was a lot of those, the brocades, the leathers, the heavy jet beading, like it did feel quite sumptuous and quite autumnal, you know, and all those bottle shades as well, the burgundies, the navies, the velvets and things like that.
Do you think there's something to be said about luxury with that? You mentioned a lot of the brocades and some of the fabrications that we were seeing. I don't know if you would find this at matchesfashion.com. Do you find that that the shopper is becoming more savvy? They want something that feels and looks luxurious, that doesn't just have a luxurious name on it?
Definitely, there's always a customer that looks for that craftsmanship in a piece, you know, and a lot more designers increasingly, as you speak to people, are spending more time on the production side and sort of not less time on the silhouette at all, but it's, you know, they're really pinning down the beading, the embroidery, and going to great lengths, you know, spending a lot of time out of the studio and traveling to, you know, wherever it may be, South America, India, to perfect those techniques. And I think there is a customer that really values that because it has that feeling of uniqueness to it, something really special. I think that's how people want to shop now, you know. I think we have seen a shift over the last couple of years where people feel that they want to invest more and buy less.
And also a lot of I think for America, a lot of the clothes look effortless, but actually when you look at how they're constructed, it's very interesting, and the way that they actually work and fall on the body, there's a real kind of science behind it. The other show that I thought really stood out, and it was almost like a haute couture show, was Tom Brown. I mean, as mad as it looked and as mad as it was styled, when you actually looked at the elements of that show, some of those pieces were just exquisite. And if you could dissect it down to like a skirt or a jacket, it was...
I really didn't like the styling of it, but I think to see those pieces up close, that's where you can see it. And that's something that doesn't, you know, come across if you're sort of not present. But it, you know, I suppose it's refreshing to see some bonkers, you know, theatre.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very theatrical, but I kind of zoomed in on when I looked at it later, the pieces, and you actually look at them and think, wow, that's you know, there's a lot of craftsmanship in each of those pieces, which...
and then at the same time, I mean, you know, this is the collection, and his autumn show was sort of not quite as out there, but still fairly theatrical or like a sort of installation. And then Michelle Obama wore it. So, I mean, that's quite New York as well, I think. That sort of being able to go from that sort of high drama to being on the cover of Vogue, or, you know, being, you know, on national news as well. And I think we'll probably see that with the Marc Jacobs collection, which felt very, very theatrical and almost sort of oppressively theatrical while we were there, because it was so hot. But when those pieces are sort of made in commercial terms, they will translate that into
the shorts. Yeah, exactly. It's so,
the brocade jackets.
Yeah, it's so wearable.
Let's stay a little bit on the Marc Jacobs collection and talk a bit about it, because it did seem to be something that really struck everyone, and there was a lot of comment about not just the collection, but I also felt more than you often get with shows, there was a lot of comment on individual pieces. You know, that sweatshirt that Georgia Jagger wore, a lot of people picked up on that. What was so striking about this? Was it the darkness of it? Was it, you know, how the combination of those very kind of historical dresses and cuts with something like a sweatshirt? What was so great about it?
I think that in particular is something that was new about it. He does, you know, he's very good at doing that theatre and that, you know, sort of heavy reference. But, you know, there were the pool slides, there were those like panels of sort of technical fabrics and things, and that felt really new alongside, you know, the sort of jet beading and that almost haberdashery kind of curtain tassel, you know, trims and things like that, and the print. But it's, there was a very sort of New York street element to it, you know, the choppy hair, the sporty sunglasses, the flat sneakers, and the way the sort of girls slouched down, you know, the catwalk. It was very cool. It wasn't trussed up or sort of, you know, in a Victoriana kind of way.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what does this say about do you think it was very reflective about how women are dressing? Do you think it was almost a comment on that?
Well, I mean, maybe. And one of the other things is, I suppose, if from his point of view, if he's mentally thinking about leaving Vuitton, he was the guy that brought Ready to Wear, you know, to that label. And so you have to sort of take stock of what you've done in your time with bringing Ready to Wear label. And I think it draws your attention very specifically to, you know, what works, what sells. He's going to be focusing a lot now on, you know, creating a really, you know, saleable pieces at his own label. And I think you sort of probably have to pin down, go back to the drawing board. Like, it's not just about a great big show with a huge train in the background, or a set of lifts, or
But having said that, there was a lot of that. There was a great big bus in the background, like there was a whole set constructed, there was a scene was set. But I thought exactly the same as what you were saying, that sort of combination of street and embellishment, or sort of couture levels of whatever, there was a real kind of juxtaposition in the collection that it felt for me sort of on the one hand kind of actually quite spine-chillingly sort of eerie, Victoria, kind of arcane, and then actually just really funny. It had a lot of wit in there, like with the sliders and with the sort of bomber jackets, with the Edwardian dress or whatever. And I think he's really, really talented and sort of singular in being able to bring two complete opposites together, and it doesn't look like they're clashing.
Does this go back to the seasonless comment that we were talking about? We were talking about the breakdown of the seasons, because to me this collection seemed to be about sort of eclecticism in how you dress and pulling things from, whether a vintage thing with a streetwear sort of cheap pool slide. It seemed to be about that kind of pulling things from all different parts of your closet. So is it about that, do you think?
For me, for once, it feels like there's really iconic pieces in that collection and pieces that you want to own. And I think that maybe it's interesting what you were saying about Vuitton, and what maybe he's learned from there is that maybe now he's trying to find a real identity for his own label, and to make kind of statement pieces that people will just style with a pair of jeans or wearing.
As it was done at Vuitton. Yeah, exactly.
So there seems to be a kind of natural progression backward. Well, this was obviously before Vuitton, but it seems to be more connected than in past seasons.
When we say a Marc Jacobs identity, I think it's almost quite easy to pinpoint it at Vuitton, but what would we say his personal identity within his own label is? People often say he's the great historian of fashion, but what would we, I hate the word codes, but I always use it, what are the Marc Jacobs codes?
I think like Harriet said, he's got great wit, he's a comedian, he has fun with it, and it's in quite he manages to do it in quite a deft way and with a light hand, and you can see that as well from his personality, like turning up to his own Christmas parties dressed as a polar bear and things like that. He's a prankster, but very, very clever with it, I think.
But it's interesting that I think you can talk quite easily about the feel of it or how he works as a designer, but it's, as Jo was saying, there isn't perhaps like that one piece that comes up every season. There's always a version of a great dress, a lovely coat, a brilliant skirt suit, lovely trousers, but it's almost like you're saying he's trying to develop a kind of like a Chanel little back jacket or something, and he's maybe looking for those pieces that could be developed within his own sort of witty way of working.
And I think that silhouette, the rounded shoulders, the nipped-in waist, maybe it's something like that, because I kind of think of him from past seasons, or especially with the Marc by Marc, it's a stylist's dream. It's like he's gone into somewhere and found something that he's loved, and then created a whole show from, it could be anything from a 70s t-shirt, but he's put his spin on it.
Are we excited about the future for Marc Jacobs then? And I mean that both for the man and also for the label, and also Marc by Marc, obviously that's going to be so exciting next season. So we're all feeling a little bit excited about what's going to definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think Luella is the perfect choice for Marc by Marc, and I think it will just sort of give it a sudden burst of energy, which is not that it's problematic now, but I think it needs that. I think it's been sort of rolling along for a while, and you know what the feel of the show is going to be. It's going to be young and fun and cool and street and a bit retro, and I'm interested to see what she does with that.
It'll be interesting to see as well the changeover from it being designed by a man to a woman. Sometimes Gucci or wherever you see that, you do sort of pick up on that change, and she'll be designing pieces that she wants to wear, that she wants. So it might have a different edge to it in that sense.
And also she when she was sort of designing in London, it felt like she was really dressing a generation of young women.
Totally.
It was a real party scene look, wasn't it? It was Alexa and Pixie and all of those people.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting that I don't feel like there's a generational scene at the moment in fashion necessarily. I think we had that, and then not much else happened. So if she can do that again, that would obviously
I think
be
there probably is that one coming out of New York, the Harley Vera Newtons and the the Lex and things like that, which I think will probably chime with that quite nicely.
Yeah, I mean, let's pick up on that a little bit more. I think that's a really interesting point about there not being sort of generations in terms of in terms of fashion. When did that kind of die, if you will?
I always equate Luella with such a specific scene in London, so 2006 to 2008, and ostensibly what happened was a credit crunch. I don't know whether it's that easy to link them, but she went under, people stopped spending as much money, parties out the window.
God,
just misery. I mean, I don't know whether that is the link, but it felt like something changed, and maybe that brand of sort of super sweet girlishness suddenly wasn't necessarily what people were looking to invest in.
It didn't feel right anymore, I think, did it? And
exactly.
it's a very conspicuous way of, being quite ostentatious.
And then you got this sort of very glamorous or kind of elegant, austere look that came into all of fashion, sort of minimalism everywhere, which is a great look, but it doesn't necessarily make for that sort of standout crowd necessarily.
And I think it's it's burgeoning again here in that sort of fashionista way with Ashley Williams and that whole sort of crowd. But that's much more of a with Claire Barrett, it's much more of a DIY sort of make do amend mentality where it starts from. It's not that sort of it's not Met Bar, it's not anything sort of glitzy at all.
I think that's a really good point, because I think that girlishness is definitely, I felt like this season particularly, I saw a lot of girlishness on the catwalk, but as you say, it is a very different, it's not kind of polished girly, there's no primness to it. But I think even in New York we saw it a little bit, with the, I want to talk next about Alex Wang, and we did see it there with those kind of, it was almost schoolgirly, some of that.
But it's still very, it's still quite flat, it's not frothy, it's not frilly, it's very utilitarian, and it's an interesting mix, I think, for that, and it's a much more practical, much more useful way of making something feminine also wearable. It's like with that Marc Jacobs quote, who is wearing white? Well, maybe someone will if there's a little motif across it, or they can wear it with some black.
It's interesting as well from the autumn winter shows with Eddie Slimane doing the collection and the whole grunge thing, and even Chanel touching on it. And it's kind of, there's a slightly playful element to it, but there's quite a strong woman that comes out of it, quite a rebellious woman. And I think that for spring summer we've kind of continued with that, and I think so Luella coming on board for next season, I think it's really interesting, because that's how I think of Luella. She's quite a strong character, and her collections, even though they were playful, there was still a rebellious streak in them.
Definitely.
Well, I think it's interesting because people often talked about that minimalism thing as being about strong women. I think particularly maybe because it was so sort of pioneered or so driven by a lot of female designers, so like Phoebe Philo. But I feel like it's a kind of austere strength, whereas I feel like rebelliousness, it's not rebellious, but I felt like rebelliousness came back a bit this season. There was a lot of subversiveness in a way that I don't think something minimal can do, and I think Luella does that in a really interesting way.
And also being confident about being girly, but you can be strong and be taken seriously standing in a kind of short prom dress or whatever the piece is. It's about kind of having the confidence and not feeling like you're being judged.
And I know it's not New York based, but I think what Eddie is doing is very important and spearheading that, because he's really putting that girl back on on the catwalk and giving her sort of the limelight again in quite a big way that other people aren't doing quite so strongly, or in comparison to what was happening at the label a couple of seasons ago.
I think to take that sort of idea with what was happening in New York, I think that idea of feminine without being frothy, practical without being sort of ugly, it was everywhere. It was this sort of sporty, girly minimalism that New York does really, really well. Victoria Beckham, case in point, really kind of a really strong look. She said it wasn't androgynous, but it was boy meets girl, and there was pink in it.
So there's a lot of pink everywhere, and I think there is that softness coming through. There's maybe a little feather trim, or there's a little sort of ruffle here, and that's kind of what feels new about it. It's not as austere as you say, as it has been before.
It's that you could sort of run for a bus in it.
You can run for a bus in it. It's just really unfussy. You can get on with your day, but everything is beautifully made, and I think that's one thing that designers, for example, from London, who go to New York to a few seasons and come back, will say is that it teaches you about production, how to pull these things together properly, how to show a collection, in terms of putting on a show, just the level of glossiness that New York sort of puts on clothes that in another situation could look a little plain. When it's coming out of New York, it just has that sort of polish and finish to it that is quite appealing.
Why do you think that sort of practicality, and also you mentioned softness, which I think is such a good point, we mentioned the pink, which we're seeing there. Why is that having a sort of a moment now? Is it because we're moving out of recession, so people are being a bit more playful? Is it just to do with general attitudes towards gender? People are less, I think women, they don't feel like they have to power dress anymore. Where is that coming from, that mood?
I think in a way people have changed their shopping habits, and it's not necessarily about saving everything up and spending it on that one amazing cocktail dress that you'll get 2 wears out of. It's about enjoying what you wear every day, all the time. And that's where people are sort of really investing in that sort of luxurious kind of day wear. And I think that has a big influence on, we're just looking at the Victoria Beckham show here, and everything there is very day wear orientated, but very expensively made and beautifully produced, and it just feels like a pleasure to wear.
Do you notice that a lot of matches that it's not about evening wear, it is the day wear that people get really excited about?
It's really across the board. I mean, you can say that, but then you have that beautiful sort of beaded Peter Pilotto, and it whizzes straight off the side. People shop across the board, but I think New York is very geared towards that kind of particular customer.
And it's almost like it's an ideology you want to buy into. You want to be the woman who looks very together while she's running for the bus or while she's at her desk, and New York just offers you that. It's a vision of your own professionalism.
And I think you get to a stage where I don't know, personally I feel like I wore a lot of colour and print for a long time, and now suddenly all you want to do is just have that perfect white shirt, the perfect black trouser, the perfect pair of brogues, and you just want no fuss, and you just want to strip everything back and sort of live in your uniform, I suppose.
Yeah, I think uniform is a really good word for this season in New York, both in a kind of sense of getting dressed and having a personal uniform, but also literal uniform. We saw so many kind of, especially at Victoria Beckham, there's kind of kiltish skirts. What was your take on Victoria Beckham? Were you impressed by it, Harriet?
Me?
Yeah.
I was. I thought there was a lot there. I thought it had moved on from last season. It had moved on in a way. It doesn't just look like stuff that she wears now, I think. Obviously, though, you can still see elements of her wardrobe, and you can imagine her probably in every single piece. But it's not, it's not coming down the runway, and you're not thinking,
VB.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that speaks volumes as to she's come in for a lot of skepticism as to whether she's cut out for this, whether she's doing it properly or whatever. But I think this proves that she is, and she was backstage, she was wearing a look of it, it looked great, but it didn't look like a carbon copy of her existing wardrobe.
I thought the sort of wide-legged culotte trousers and the more masculine side of the collection was interesting for her, and I think what you're saying is like her breaking away from the mould of the whole body conscious.
Definitely.
It's like she's sort of, I feel like she's kind of gathering, and she's finding her stride with it, and like you say, stepping out from backstage in a white shirt and black trousers, and realising there is another side to this kind of really uptight.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that gathering speed thing is something that's an important conversation as well, with so much movement at the moment within the industry. Is people, designers should be given seasons to get into their stride and find their pace, and it's really hard having to put yourself out for judgment every few months, and
which is why it's perhaps good that this feels less like her as a person.
Absolutely.
But it still has that, it is inherently pretty, but some of the pieces are actually quite difficult to wear. A challenging trouser, perhaps, albeit a very nice one. But it isn't this kind of obvious, everyone will look good in this. Because I think that's what she started out with.
Talking of a collection that I don't think many people would look good in, let's talk about Alexander Wang, because this really divided opinion. I really loved it because I adore the 90s and I'm completely obsessed by anything 90s, but what was your take? Because it's completely split opinion. Some people loved it, some people...
I thought it was more noughties. I thought it was that sort of logomania. That you can see there just on that piece, the sort of dark denim with the stitches. It's like, it's fiddy, isn't it? And I think there's nothing wrong with that. But it's nipped in and it's deconstructed and it's redone for a woman who doesn't want to look like a rapper. And again, it's that sense of a uniform done in a different way. It's almost, it's like, if you're buying into this is your Alexander Wang uniform, and it's got his name all over it, and if you like it, then why not?
What do you think about him putting his name all over it? Are we ready for the return of sort of
Logos.
Oh.
I think it's very different when you're writing your name a lot in lots of rows in a very small way than just one big one across the front. And actually, you know, we're looking at pieces here that are covered, like that sort of, that fabric on the shorts is logo. But you can't tell, you know, so.
Yeah, I think it's clever. I mean, I think it's fun, and actually that will be a collection, you know, that you remember in a couple of seasons' time because it was the logo one. And, you know, I think it's very comfortable. I just need to get to Pilates so that I can wear those tiny running shorts.
But also, I mean, it was beautifully made, which if it hadn't been executed in such a beautiful way, then again, it wouldn't have worked so well.
I think that's something about the Balenciaga crossover. It's like he's going to have access to a lot, you know, of, you know, atelier techniques and production and you know, sort of historical archives that he hasn't necessarily had before, and that will definitely start trickling in.
Did you see that reflected in this collection? Because a lot of the criticism of it, it was oversimplistic, it wasn't challenging or technical, but did you think it was? You could see that Balenciaga influence.
I think you can see it in the cut, can't you?
Definitely, and exactly in the fabrication. I mean, it's quite an art. So actually, and some of there was was it a laser cut trench coat further on, which was beautiful.
And I think what he does so well is he does speak to that tribe of sort of, you know, the American sort of supermodel, you know, young, all his friends, you know, and that's something that comes out of New York a lot, that surrounds Fashion Week. I think, you know, you see a lot of celebrities on the front row. It's sort of, it has that kind of high octane feeling to it, even when it is downplayed and understated and it is streetwear. It's still very, I don't know, there's big buzz surrounding it.
Yeah, we at Never Underdressed, we got slightly obsessed with the idea of a street style tactic or blogger catnip, and which is not a bad thing. But you know, these pieces that have writing on, they get you photographed, and I think that is that kind of model off duty, like looking for a bit of a buzz as you leave the show.
Totally.
If you're wearing a parental advisory top, you're going to get that.
We've talked actually.
You wonder how long the Kenzo sweatshirt can sort of last. So they need to,
We've talked actually about this on a lot of these panels because I'm quite obsessed with sort of digital and how that affects fashion. And you seem to imply there, you know, you said bloggers, but I feel like, you know, like the digital sort of space for imagery, so things like Instagram, it has actually affected design. You know, I feel like designers are putting stuff out there. It's not just so it looks good on style.com, it is also so it looks good on social media.
Yeah, definitely. And it's perhaps that's why it's a return to that sort of logo culture. It's getting that identity out there as quickly as you possibly can. There were a lot of shows this season, not just in New York, but kind of across the board, where there were sort of words, you know,
well, Christopher Kane
slogans, exactly,
It's always been there to a degree in the phrase, you know, hanger appeal, and you know when you see something in a store and it just looks like a sort of drab bit of something on a hanger, but it's the most amazing sort of drapery and sculpting. And now it is all about screen appeal, you know, and designers have said it, they do say it, it's like that will pop on the screen, whether it's in Instagram or e-com or whatever it is. I think you have to be aware of it.
There was, I read a thing about when Reiko Okubo was sort of first selling to boutiques, taking Comme des Garçons and things, she would take the clothes, which was a sort of, you know, limp strand of whatever, and then she'd have to take a lookbook picture with her and say, no, this is what it actually looks like on the body. And it's just another version of that, you know, it's showing people what it can look like sort of IRL, which is a new thing, and people have so much more access to that.
Do you think it's dangerous though, because obviously with people often talk about this, that black doesn't sell well online, but I think it's also, you can't see cut and fit or technique really in Instagram. You know, you just see logo and you just see colour. Do you think it's going to be slightly dangerous for designers if there is this constant sort of pressure to turn out something that it's going to be, you know, we're looking at that
a sort of street style hit? I think it goes beyond social media into actual street style, in which you can, I think, tell the cut and the shape, and obviously not the fabrication, but you know, you can see how it fits on a person, a very beautiful person, probably quite a thin person as well. But you can see someone wearing it, and they're with the street style shot, you know, it's not necessarily a head to toe look either, so you can see how it interacts with jeans or, you know, wardrobe staples or whatever. I think it's just it's kind of another way of, maybe it's a new type of catalogue almost.
That's interesting.
I think one of the other kickbacks from social media overexposure though is just by the time things hit the store, you feel like you've lived it and you've worn it and you've breathed it, and you haven't even been able to buy it yet. And that is a real danger, I think, because it just takes the specialness out of it. You know, it takes the pleasure out of that arrival and that moment when it's ready now. Like, you know,
or if the stuff doesn't actually reach store because of this, people actually see it, read about it, looked at it, ordered it, and the drop doesn't actually get there because they've sold out and they're reordering. So
I wondered if that was part of the thing behind that sort of very anti-seasonal feel with the sort of the black, the coat. It's, I think, working in fashion, you see everything a season ahead, so you're used to going into the stores and thinking, I don't want any of this anymore, I want the next thing. But I think the more that people can see all of the shows immediately, watching live streams, you know, people out there feel like that as well. So I don't know whether the answer is to come up with this, you know, a black coat or something much more simple, or something that's sort of very obviously of a season, so people can say, look, I got it.
And it's just the way that you dress naturally as well, isn't it? There's always going to be that blazer in your wardrobe that you go back to, or that pair of trousers that doesn't shout sort of SS14, but you still love it and it works. And that's how it should be. It shouldn't really be any other way. No, there's very few people that can do a complete wardrobe haul once a season.
The other thing I've noticed a lot over all of the shows is this kind of link between art and fashion. A lot of the prints, a lot of the poster prints, a lot of them sort of look like squiggles or paintings, or the references for things. And I think the other thing is that people seem to be investing in pieces that feel unique. So in the mix of having very simple, wearable or sort of staple pieces in your wardrobe, people still want that one thing that is so unique. And I don't know, I mean, you might know more about this, but I don't know how many of those pieces, particularly with something like the Prada, how many of those pieces will actually go into production, because they're so unique, whether they'll only be a limited edition.
I think it really depends. I mean, in the Christopher Kane showroom, we were talking about that pressed sort of foil fabric, and I think maybe one piece of that will or something, but it was such an important part of the collection, in the show, it's hard. But then if the demand is there, then people will sort of bend over backwards, because it's staggering the people that will, like you say, invest many thousands in those key
and
pieces.
there were I mean, I can't think off the top of my head but there were a few pieces throughout New York which I found,
think in the Mark show, especially all that beautiful sort of jet beading and brocade and those heavy pieces.
But to contrast that, I also think that as much as there was a focus on things feeling very unique, there was also a deliberate focus on taking something that's incredibly sort of prolific, incredibly ubiquitous, and playing with that. So we're looking at that logo, which I think has been on a poster on pretty much 90% of teenagers' doors at some point. But also with that sort of Coke can sweater that we mentioned before from the Marc Jacobs collection, and there's almost a play on something, feeling incredibly obvious, which contradicts. I think completely agree. You saw that with Prada, and I think with Celine as well. That focus on something being very artistic and very unique. There's also the flip side of that, which I find quite interesting.
I thought one of the interesting things in New York was 30 years of DKNY, and their show was very much a sort of greatest hits, and that was one of the labels that really went for street culture and logo culture and really introduced it, and it's been
Rita Ora and
absolutely but even in sort of I guess in the late 80s and 90s, that's how people started wearing kind of emblems on themselves. It was to sort of be part of a club, and that feels like something that's coming through again, I think, definitely.
I'm glad you mentioned DKNY, because I do want to talk a little bit. We've spoken about some of sort of the New York big hitters, but I'd like to ask a bit about those original stalwarts of New York, the reason that the people that put New York Fashion Week kind of on the map. So you mentioned Donna Karan. Are we still as excited by the old guard, or is it?
Well, I suppose they're old new guard, because Francisco's obviously at Calvin Klein now, and I actually thought Calvin Klein was a really interesting.
That was
beautiful.
I felt like that had moved on, because everything we've talked about before is I felt like Calvin was one of those shows that every season you could kind of predict it, and I feel like a lot of the designers have kind of fallen into that.
I think there is a real romantic sort of element to New York in that sort of Oscar de la Renta, Carolina Herrera. It's, you know, it's kind of exactly what you want to be in a few years' time. You know, with your sort of little, you know, tweed suit and your flippy skirt and your pulled together sort of, you know, handbag on the arm. And I think it's great that happens there, and it's a really important part of what happens in the week, definitely. And so I think there's that sort of uptown, you know, side, and then there's also the big heavy hitters, the Calvins, you know, Ralph Lauren, Tommy Hilfiger, and all of those big sportswear labels as well that have a very, you know, they have a part to play for sure. It's not necessarily the part that drives the trends, but it's you know, the big stalwarts of the week.
But it's interesting though. I feel like all of those sort of old school New York labels, they're for women, and New York Fashion Week, I think, feels like it's for women in a way that some of the other ones don't. And maybe it's because people have been focusing on that sort of very girlish aspect. Maybe it's because, you know, other cities focus on bling or on sort of avant-garde. New York is clothes for women to wear every day. And Donna Karan is, you know, she pioneered that, and Michael Kors does it. And so, but even the kind of Ferenc Schulers are the new generation of that. I think that's very much a theme of the week.
Talking about a collection that slightly contradicts this idea of clothes for women, let's speak about Reigate, because I think that kind of shocked everyone a little bit. What was our take on the Reigate show? Everyone's stunned into silence. Did you like it, Harriet?
I thought it was interesting. What I thought was interesting is that it was very, very different from anything else that we saw, and it's also fairly different from anything else that they've done. But in its own way, it still fed into those trends. So it was black and white, there was fringing, there were sporty elements, there were sheer things, there was check, everyone loves check. And so it didn't, you know, once you kind of broke it down, it didn't feel that outre compared to the other stuff that was going on. I think they have a sort of customer base that wants to look different while fitting in and saying that they're very cool, and that's what they've done.
I think it was a very hard to wear collection though. There weren't those pieces in there that, you know, amongst the sort of creativity you could pull out those, you know, wardrobe essentials, which is
Fringe
fine.
bra?
It doesn't.
Come on.
You know, and that's fine, and it doesn't have to be there, and there will be an extended part of the collection, you know, commercial collection, which is present. But that was something that felt quite different to it compared to every other collection. Where, for example, with Proenza, there was that beautiful artistry, but there was also pieces that you wanted.
You could pull out.
Yeah.
We've said that it was quite different to what we'd expect from Reigate. Did you think that as well, Jo?
Yeah, and also I just think less is more, and it doesn't feel very modern, and it feels like they have 1,000 ideas rather than one. So
they're always a bit like that, I think. And sometimes it comes together in something that looks very classical, and sometimes it comes together in something that I think is deliberately meant to make you think, but I haven't noticed that from them before. It always feels kind of almost a bit hippy-dippy when they can sort of mix all those references, and here, not so much.
They're very sort of personal designers in how they work. They draw a lot on their own lives, their own experience, their sort of histories growing up, and that formed quite a large part of the inspiration for this collection, and particularly last season as well. And Tilly, you made a really interesting point before about the change that we'll see with Luella being a female designer taking over a label previously designed by a man. And for me, do you think this is, we mentioned it with Victoria Beckham as well, do you think there is something to be said about women when they're designing clothes for other women, that they do make it more of a personal story? Maybe that's why there's so many ideas, because it isn't about this kind of focused fantasy of a woman, it becomes more about your own life. I guess so.
I mean, if you're talking about New York, you have to talk about Donna Karan in that instance, you know, because that's sort of her métier and what she's created a business around doing. But then you can see it, you know, done very successfully in many other places. Oscar, Marc Jacobs, you know, for example. And so not necessarily. And you know, if you're being very straightforward about it, I don't necessarily see this as clothes that those girls would wear. So it's, you know, I think it can play on both sides.
Yeah, both sides.
It's a very editorial collection, isn't it?
It's going to be shot a lot.
You know, it's going to be everywhere, and you're going to see it, and it's going to create imagery. And if I guess that's another tactic in terms of creating an identity for a brand.
But there's a danger of it being avant-garde for the sake of being avant-garde, rather than the consideration that these are the people that buy the clothes, and I just feel it doesn't feel well thought through.
I think you can be editorial without being avant-garde.
Yeah.
And I think that may or may not be a problem with this collection.
We talked a little bit, you said it didn't feel modern day, we have talked a little bit about nostalgia with the whole 90s and noughties thing. And mainly because I love them, I want to talk a bit about the 90s, because that felt like something that we saw across the whole of fashion season, particularly in New York, even at places like Jason Wu, we saw a lot of flash, those kind of shoestring straps. Why does that feel quite now, that kind of nostalgia? Because it was also present in that Redoute collection we just looked at.
I think in a way, you can argue that London was the birthplace of that with Corinne Day and various things, but really for it to come out of New York and to be thinking about Calvin Klein and those ad campaigns and sort of Herb Ritts images of, that time, it really feels like its natural home. And so I think in a way there's always a little element of it there, but then it just kind of seemed to gather momentum over the month and really grow. And it just plays into that unfussiness. It's very stripped down, it's very easy. You'd see images of Kate Moss wearing her little slip dress with a pool slide straight out of the 90s, and it just feels sort of relevant again.
But it's that sort of, it's that Helmut Lang thing as well, and I think he was the first person to take that to New York, really, and what he was doing at that point was so different that everyone wanted a piece of it, and it feels like maybe that just never went away from the city's kind of outlook. It's very urban feeling. It's grungy, but without being kind of grotty or too.
It's about a state
rocky.
of mind, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's really interesting you say about Helmut Lang, because it's also the mix of fabrics and mixing different fabrics in one top, and it's almost like those pieces you were saying earlier about having something that's just quite simple, but that it feels expensive and it's really beautifully made. And I think with New York, that's what you think of. You think of having something with some of the dresses that we're looking at now. There's so many components to them, but they're hung off a racing back. They're very, very simple shapes, but I think there's a lot more to it than.
And I think in the styling as well, like across the season, there was quite a sort of dressed undressed thing happening with a little, like you say, a shoestring strap and a men's cardigan hanging off the shoulder, and there was quite a lot of that, and always with a flat shoe as well, so it feels a bit more loose.
But maybe that's being really boring. Maybe that's also a season thing. Is that seasons are so kind of out of kilter. It's like, it's about layering up. So it's not going out.
Side to it, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
One collection I want to talk about, both in terms of the clothes that we saw, but also because it was a really exciting season, is Altazara. We mentioned it right at the start, but I'd like to pick up a little bit more, because we didn't actually do an Altazara panel this season, which was such a shame, because obviously there was so much news given the Kering investment. Were you guys pleased to see that investment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really exciting, and I think it feels like that is snowballing now with other younger designers, which is really important, because it hasn't happened for 10 years. So that's really exciting, and it feels like he's like moving on leaps and bounds every collection. It's exactly the kind of woman that you aspire to be, someone who's sort of sexy and pulled together, but he's relaxed and looks effortless.
And also how different this was from Autumn. That was
so different.
Very sort of. It's still very wearable, but much more buttoned up, almost kind of bodycon, quite severe, a little bit 80s. And then this is just so. I mean, it's still kind of tailoring, but it's really romantic, I thought, and there was this nod to, again, those sort of the Japanese avant-garde, the sort of deconstruction and the lacing, and I think it was based around sort of Japanese kind of traditional artisan methods. It just felt very, very easy.
I think with Joseph in particular, like his production and the quality of the design is amazing. Like he develops a lot of those fabrics in Japan. A lot of that tailoring is, it's sort of travel ready, so you can scrunch it up and put it in your bag and it springs back into a beautiful shape. And a lot of the complicated pieces that look like they're sort of nipped and tucked and wrapped are just fastened with one zip. And I think that sort of mentality that underpins the designs is what has maybe set him apart from the other sort of stable at the moment of the Prebbles and the Philip Lims and everybody else.
I don't think his work feels easy. We mentioned that it's the woman that you aspire to be, but it doesn't feel like it's designed. Yes, I think that's such a good point. It feels aspirational. You said the woman you want to be. It doesn't feel like it's designed for a set woman in mind. And what is that quite interesting to see him given an investment, because it does, especially in the context of also seeing J.W. Anderson. obviously invested in as well. It seems to suggest to me that it's not just about investing in product now, it's about investing in design and vision. I don't know if you guys would agree.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's only so much of a lifespan you can get from product, you know, and whereas vision is or should be something that is infinite, really. And when you think about the types of people who get this investment, Christopher Kane, or when Nicola Chesquier went to Balenciaga in the first place, you know, it's the brain that they want. It's not necessarily the what's on the hanger.
Actually, interestingly, with all those people you've mentioned, it always comes down to kind of fabric technology and having the money to be able to do what you really want to and realise it exactly. And the thing is, with this collection, that's what it looks like. It's again having something as simple as a pencil skirt that you know is going to be beautiful, and the fabric is going to be beautiful, and it's like something that is a real investment piece, but also it's something that you can wear over and over again, and style in lots of different ways. So I just think.
And I think that aspirational thing is really key with it, because it's great to have a week of sort of brilliantly put together sportswear and sort of scuba fabrics and everything like that, but you do want something to look up to and to excite you and to, you know, instill all those feelings of you know, sort of wonder about something. And I think he does that in a cleverly mediated way, so that it doesn't feel like in a sort of Parisian, out of reach, dreamlike way. He does it in a way that just that's just enough.
I also think there's always a slight element of bad taste in what he does, and New York always feels very proper. You know, we talked about it feeling very clean, and aside from perhaps Marc Jacobs, it doesn't feel particularly witty. Do you think that's part of his success, that slight sort of, it's always a little bit so, you know, so wrong it's right?
I don't know. I don't necessarily see that in his.
Do you not?
Yeah.
Alex Fury is obsessed with this. We always talk about it together, because I certainly see it, and he always talks about it with, you know, like a mink line dress, and it's so kind of bad that it flips over to good.
I think maybe there was an element of that for autumn, but I think that was kind of playing on that sort of 80s Beige, you know, thing. I think with this it felt much more organic and much more romantic. And I suppose there is such thing as bad taste romance, but I don't think this was it.
Yeah, I'd agree.
So was this a standout for all of you then for the season?
I thought it was lovely.
Diplomatic as always.
I mean, there's elements within this show that I love, but
I think the thing about New York as well is that it's so vast, and there's so many different schools of designer that you can pick a favourite from each. So, you know, from the sort of heavy hitters from the sportswear tribe, from the midwear tribe, it's sort of very hard to pin down just one thing. And also to look at it in the sense of what it is that you want to wear that you love, or what it is that gets your imagination going. You know, there's different ways of.
Is that why Marc is always seen as so separate from New York? Is that why he was he's his own man in a sense, because it is just completely outside of those tribes that you talk about? It is just.
I think so.
Definitely. And
the same way as Misha Prada, it's like it's outside of, you know, sort of that.
It's a different approach entirely. It's almost a different way of a designer consuming fashion or presenting it. It's just not the same at all, I think.
If we had to sum up this season in New York, what would we say? We've mentioned sportswear, we've mentioned that ease. Maybe it's a woman running for a bus. Maybe that's our vision of New York this season.
I think it is that state of mind, isn't it? Just with very polished legs and a skirt slit up to here.
And a pair of pool slides.
But it might also be quite cold and raining.
And they'd have really silky smooth hair.
She sounds like quite a confused lady, doesn't she?
I think a lot of them are.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.